I did everything right. At least, that's what I was told. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided for most of my life. I didn't ruin my life by making bad choices. I ruined it by making only the right ones. From an early age, I learned what was expected of me. Not explicitly, no one sat me down and gave me rules, but the message was everywhere. In reactions. In praise. In silence. Be reasonable. Be stable. Don't cause trouble. I absorbed those expectations quietly and made them my compass. Every decision passed through the same internal filter. Is this the right thing to do? Not what I wanted. Not what felt alive. Just what was correct, appropriate, acceptable. That approach was rewarded. I stayed out of trouble. I followed the path that made sense. I avoided risks that could complicate my future. I learned to delay gratification, to think long-term, to choose security over impulse. People trusted me. They said I was mature beyond my years. I believed them. I built my life carefully, like someone assembling furniture exactly according to the instructions. Nothing was crooked. Nothing collapsed. Everything fit together neatly. From the outside, it looked like success. Inside, something felt off, but not enough to justify complaint. That was the problem. There was no obvious pain to point to. No dramatic failure. No crisis that demanded change. Just a low-level sense of disconnection that followed me quietly through the years. I ignored it. Discomfort, I told myself, was normal. Everyone sacrifices something. Meaning comes later. Fulfillment is earned. So I kept going. I chose careers that were respectable, not exciting. Relationships that were stable, not demanding. Lifestyles that were sensible, not expressive. Every choice reduced uncertainty, and with it, reduced risk. I told myself I was building a solid life. What I was really building was a life with very little room for me. I didn't notice when my preferences started to fade. When my opinions softened into neutrality. When my reactions became predictable and measured instead of honest. I became very good at agreeing. Not because I lacked thoughts, but because disagreement felt unnecessary. Complicating things felt irresponsible. Being correct mattered more than being real. People liked me. That should have felt good. Instead, it made me uneasy. Because I wasn't sure what they liked. Was it me, or the version of me that never disrupted anything? I started to feel like I was living in parentheses. Present, but secondary. Like my life was an explanation rather than an experience. I told myself this was adulthood. That intensity fades. That passion settles. That wanting less is a sign of wisdom. But late at night, alone, I felt a strange grief I couldn't explain. Not grief for something lost. Grief for something unlived. I realized I had very few memories where I felt fully exposed. Where my heart had been involved enough to risk embarrassment or failure. My life was full of correct decisions, and empty of moments that demanded courage. I wasn't unhappy. I was uninvolved. And being uninvolved in your own life is harder to notice than being miserable. Because misery has a voice. This was just silence. The first time I admitted something was wrong, it felt almost shameful. Who complains about doing well? Who questions a life that works? But the question wouldn't leave. Who would I be if I stopped trying to be right? That thought scared me. Because I didn't know the answer. I had spent so long adjusting myself to expectations that I no longer recognized my own internal signals. Desire felt foreign. Anger felt inappropriate. Longing felt childish. I had trained myself out of myself. And I didn't yet understand how much that training had cost me. Once the question appeared, who would I be if I stopped trying to be right, it didn't let me go. I tried to answer it logically, the way I answered everything else. I listed roles. Responsibilities. Achievements. Relationships. All the things that proved I was doing well. None of them answered the question. They described my life. They didn't describe me. I started noticing how often I adjusted myself without realizing it. How quickly I softened opinions to avoid friction. How instinctively I chose the response that would keep things smooth. It wasn't conscious anymore. Being right had become a reflex. And reflexes don't ask whether they still serve you. I realized I didn't know what I actually wanted unless it aligned with what was reasonable. Desire had to pass through approval before I allowed myself to feel it. If it didn't make sense on paper, I dismissed it as immature or impractical. I had become my own censor. That censor kept me safe, and deeply distant from myself. The first time I tried to step outside that pattern, it felt wrong in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not rebellious. Not freeing. Just wrong. Like I was violating an internal rule I had never consciously agreed to. I expressed an opinion that didn't land well. Nothing dramatic. Just honest. The room shifted slightly. A pause. A look. Mild discomfort. My body reacted immediately. Tight chest. Racing thoughts. The urge to explain, soften, retract. To restore the image of being reasonable. I apologized. Not because I was wrong. Because I was uncomfortable being seen as difficult. That moment stayed with me. I realized how deeply I depended on approval to feel legitimate. How much of my identity was built on being agreeable, reliable, correct. Approval had replaced self-trust so gradually that I hadn't noticed the exchange. I didn't ask myself, is this true for me? I asked, will this be accepted? That question shaped everything. As I became more aware of it, the cost grew clearer. I wasn't just avoiding conflict. I was avoiding presence. Avoiding the risk of being misunderstood. Avoiding the possibility that if I showed up honestly, I might not be liked as much. And liking had become my currency. The thought of losing that approval terrified me. Because I didn't know what would remain if it was gone. I tried small experiments. Saying no without a justification. Letting silence linger instead of filling it with reassurance. Allowing someone to be mildly disappointed without rushing to fix it. Each time felt like standing on unstable ground. The discomfort wasn't external. It was internal. I felt selfish. Immature. Ungrateful. All the labels I had learned to fear. My mind worked overtime trying to pull me back into correctness. This isn't who you are. You're better than this. Don't make things harder than they need to be. But underneath those thoughts, something else stirred. A quiet sense of relief. As if a part of me had been waiting patiently for permission to exist. I started to see how being right had protected me from rejection, but also from intimacy. When you're always correct, you're never fully exposed. People see the polished version, not the uncertain, messy parts that actually connect. I had built a life that functioned well. It just didn't feel like mine. The more I allowed myself to step slightly out of line, the more resistance I felt, not from others, but from the identity I had built. The good one. The reliable one. The one who never caused trouble. That identity didn't want to die quietly. It reminded me of everything I could lose. Respect. Stability. Predictability. The safety of knowing where I stood. And it was right. I could lose those things. But another truth became impossible to ignore. I had already lost something far more important. Myself. I wasn't living badly. I was living correctly in a life that didn't ask who I was, only whether I behaved. That realization hurt more than any criticism ever had. Because it meant no one had taken my life from me. I had handed it over willingly, one correct decision at a time. I could feel a breaking point approaching. A moment where I would have to decide whether being right was worth continuing to feel absent. Whether approval was worth the constant quiet grief of never fully showing up. I didn't know yet what I would choose. I only knew that staying inside correctness forever would mean never meeting myself at all. And that felt like a loss I could no longer explain away. I didn't stop trying to be right in a dramatic way. I stopped because I couldn't breathe anymore. Not physically, internally. The constant adjustment, the silent calculations, the pressure to remain acceptable in every room had turned my life into a performance I could no longer sustain. I was exhausted from managing impressions instead of living reactions. The breaking point wasn't a crisis. It was a sentence I almost didn't say. Someone asked me what I wanted. Not in a philosophical way, practically, directly. A simple question that should have had a simple answer. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't know what was reasonable. Because I didn't know what was true. That silence exposed everything. I realized that if I couldn't answer that question honestly, then being right had finally cost me the ability to exist as myself. I had become fluent in correctness and illiterate in desire. So I answered anyway. Not carefully. Not optimally. Honestly. The response wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly bold. But it didn't align with expectations. It disrupted the image I had spent years maintaining. The reaction was subtle. Confusion. Discomfort. A slight cooling of tone. No one attacked me. No one condemned me. They simply adjusted, and in that adjustment, something important shifted. I felt exposed. And strangely, relieved. That moment taught me something I had never allowed myself to learn. Approval is fragile. It exists as long as you perform the version of yourself people are comfortable with. The moment you step outside of that script, it wavers. Sometimes it disappears. Sometimes it recalibrates. I lost some of it. People didn't turn against me. But they no longer knew exactly where to place me. The reliable one had become unpredictable. The correct one had developed edges. Some relationships thinned. Some conversations became shorter. Some expectations dissolved. That hurt. Because it meant facing a truth I had avoided my entire life. Some people didn't know me. They knew my compliance. Letting that sink in was painful. I had invested years in being liked for my correctness, and now I was discovering how conditional that liking had been. Not malicious, just limited. But something else happened alongside that loss. I felt real. Not confident. Not empowered. Real. For the first time, my reactions belonged to me. My words carried risk. My presence carried weight. I wasn't guaranteed approval anymore, and that made my participation honest. I learned how to tolerate disapproval without collapsing. How to sit in awkwardness without apologizing for existing. How to let someone misunderstand me without immediately correcting the narrative. It was uncomfortable. It was also grounding. I didn't become reckless. I didn't reject responsibility or burn bridges for the sake of rebellion. I simply stopped editing myself to fit an invisible standard of rightness that had never asked who I was. The grief came later. Grief for the years I had spent being correct instead of alive. For the moments I had softened myself out of fear. For the choices I had never made because they felt improper. That grief didn't break me. It clarified me. I began to understand something that had always been hidden beneath my need to be right. Correctness is not morality. Approval is not connection. Stability is not identity. I hadn't lived badly. I had lived carefully in a life that never asked for my truth. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, someone who prides themselves on being reasonable, dependable, correct, I'm not telling you to become careless. I'm telling you to ask one dangerous question. Who are you when being right stops being the goal? If the answer scares you, that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you found yourself at the edge of something real. I tried to live the right way my entire life. And in doing so, I slowly erased the part of me that made that life mine. I don't know if I've fully found myself yet. But I know this. I would rather be imperfectly present than perfectly absent. I would rather risk disapproval than live unseen. I did everything right. And only when I stopped did my life finally begin to feel like it belonged to me.